Well, it's an absolute honour today to welcome David Southern on to be interviewed. He's a professional photographer based in Northumberland. How are you, David?
I'm very well this morning, thank you. Yeah, it's a nice morning here.
Same here. Yeah, it's beautiful. The weather's been lovely the last few days. Thank you very much for coming on and chatting today. I'd love people to get to know a little bit more about you as a photographer, and we'll be specifically speaking more about your intimate seascape photographs today, because that's really what interested me to ask you to come on here. But before we get into all of that, can you just explain to everybody who you are and what you do as a photographer?
Right. Well, I'm a full-time photographer. I don't use the term professional because I'm not quite sure what the distinction between professional and amateur is these days. And it's certainly not one of quality of image. But anyway, I try and spend every waking minute of the day on photography. So that would make me a full-time photographer. I was working for a conservation organisation, the World Wildlife Fund, for many years, for 19 years, before managing to shift my lifestyle, if you like, so that I can now spend all the time I want, as I say, on photography. I'm based on the coast, and it's the coast and the sea that really is the main focus for my photography these days. I was brought up on the sea. I was brought up on a peninsula, on the Wirral Peninsula. Some people may recognise my accent, which has seawater on three sides. So I like to think I was always drawn to the sea, and certainly here where I live, I can see Coquet Island from my office here, and I go to the coast every day, and that's where I spend most of my time with my camera these days.
Brilliant. That's really interesting, actually, because I was brought up in a village that it's not quite a peninsula, but it goes out into the sea, and you've got the sea on three sides as well. So I can totally resonate with how being brought up somewhere like that could influence you to become so interested in the coast and photography specifically. So I'm guessing it was you being brought up by the sea that first inspired you to pick up a camera.
Well, I didn't have a camera until I was in my mid-20s for various reasons. We never really had a camera at home. My parents didn't really, photography didn't feature in their lives at all. We didn't have a video camera, and we didn't have a stills camera. But on every summer, my parents had a caravan on the Isle of Anglesey. So when we went on the Wirral surrounded by sea, we were on the beach in the Isle of Anglesey. And I remember even when I was really small, I used to take mental snapshots of scenes I would see, and actually just physically kind of click with my fingers like this. I remember doing that from a really small age. So although I didn't have a camera to use at the time, I like to think those virtual snapshots have been stored somewhere in our hard drive, and one day maybe we'll be able to print from them. Who knows where technology will go in the future? So yeah, so I did that all the time until I could actually buy a camera myself. So in my early 20s, I bought a second-hand Pentax K1000, which is a completely manual camera, a beautiful, robust camera. And I wish I hadn't sold it, because some of the conditions I photograph in now, I would love a completely manual camera to use, because it was absolutely solid as a rock. So yeah, that was my first introduction to, and it was a great way to learn photography. You know, you had to learn about shutter speed and ISO and f-stops and manual focusing. So you really kind of understood the basics of photography, rather than just buying a DSLR or mirrorless camera these days and kind of just putting on auto, which a lot of people do.
I love that, how before you got a camera, you were physically going out there and just sort of taking these mental snapshots of the world around you. It was almost like you were born to get into photography, and you kind of knew that it was always sort of in your blood growing up. That's lovely. I've never really heard of anyone kind of speaking about that before, so it's really interesting to hear that you did that before you got your camera. Do you think that it was growing up by the sea that's made the coast particularly be your main focus and interest now?
Yeah, yes, I do. I moved abroad after graduating for a couple of years. I actually lived close to the sea then, and then I moved to Surrey, which is a beautiful wooded, hilly, landlocked county, home county. And although it was a beautiful place, I just used to yearn to go to the sea all the time. And unfortunately, it's not that easy to get to the sea from Surrey, particularly on busy weekends and things. But I always knew I'd come back at some point to live on the coast. And I looked all around the UK, and through a process of kind of elimination almost, I ended up on the Northumberland coast.
It's interesting, isn't it? I think no matter where we live in the world, we're always like drawn to one specific area or one specific landscape. And yeah, it's lovely that you've been able to get back to the coast, which fuels you so much and that you have so much interest in. But one thing I'd like to speak to you about before we get on to your specific coastal photography now is the work that you've done with the World Wildlife Fund, because I can see kind of on your website that you briefly go into this, but you've contributed to some of their projects in countries like South Africa. So yeah, would you kindly explain a little bit about the work that you did for them?
Yeah, well, my main career before I went to WWF was in IT. So I was an IT manager, and the dream job came up. I was actually working in the financial sector in London at the time, and then a job came up in the paper that said, we're looking for a head of IT at the World Wildlife Fund at the WWF. I thought, fantastic, that's my dream job, because I'd always, ever since seeing David Attenborough's Life on Earth series back in the 1970s, I just had this passion for the environment and environmental concerns as well. And I remember even at the age of 16 joining a party called the Ecology Party that then morphed into the Green Party. So, at a very early age, I felt passionate about conservation. So when the dream job came up, I thought, that's got to be mine. And it's one of those things you put out to the universe and say, this is me doing that job, and that's how it will be. And it transpired that I did get the job, and there was some fantastic, as well as traveling with the work and visiting some of their conservation projects around the globe. I was able to ride to work as well. So the whole package felt environmentally friendly to me. I could get on my push bike and ride to work. And I used to take a camera with me. I'd ride along the River Wey in the misty mornings and take pictures on my way to work. So I'd almost scratched the photography itch before I got into work to do a serious day's work developing IT for the organisation.
Oh, brilliant. It's good actually that you've been able to work with a conservation charity. In my early 20s, I spent a lot of my time out of work going on holidays and stuff, going to actually do conservation weeks with different charities around Scotland. And it really helps you to understand, of course, environmental concerns that whatever country you're working in and on a global scale, what we're kind of going through. And I spent quite a lot of work doing conservation voluntary work with things like Trees for Life and the Scottish Wildlife Trust and the RSPB. And it's amazing actually to be in that environment and to be learning about it all. But from a photography perspective, it really helps you to feel more connected to what you're photographing and understand the bigger concerns that are going on. Did you find that when you were working with them?
Yeah, certainly, because IT is not really connected to the direct coalface of conservation. So I would be, I'd have to travel, say, to a head office, say, in Colombia, for example, and develop their IT capacity within the head office. But I always used to add on a few days of my own time to go and visit one of their projects in the field. And I went to some fascinating places. In Colombia, there's a place called Bahia Malaga, which is where the whales come to breed, and WWF were doing a project there to get some engagement with the local communities in terms of sustainable fishing, and with the local authorities not to dredge in this bay. And it was great to go out with the fishermen, see the whales, see the environment, and live as they did for a while. There were other projects like visiting the seabird, the nesting turtles on the beaches of Malaysia, for example, and trying to work with the people there for sustainable tourism, so that hotels didn't flood like beaches in the evenings, so that the turtles wouldn't be distracted from their nest sites and those sorts of things. So there was a lot of on the ground opportunity to take images for the organisation to use for their marketing material as well.
Ah, brilliant, fantastic. And do you feel that the work that you did through that is now helping influence the work that you're now doing, back in the UK with your photography locally, and all the kind of knowledge that you've learned about the environment in general globally? Do you feel it's kind of tying now into the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, it does. During lockdown, I'm fortunate enough to live close to a summer seabird nesting site, a nest site for kittiwakes. And during lockdown, I could get on my bike, and that was my daily exercise. But I took my camera, my tripod, and I spent the whole of the first lockdown summer in the company of a noisy colony of kittiwakes, just observing the behaviours and throughout the whole breeding season, when they arrive in late April to when they leave in early August, when the chicks are fledged. And my background in conservation very much informed what I was doing there. It's an interesting question you asked me, actually, Kim, because I was thinking this morning. I went down to the coast this morning, and after the busy public holiday, there's some pollution on the beach, and people have left some things there. And I was thinking, how can I start to build a conservation message, or an original conservation message, into my current photography work, because I'm taking pictures of rocks and seaweed, and the connection isn't really obvious. But we see plastic on the beach. I see seabirds that have been strangled in discarded fishing lines, and those sort of environmental issues are all around us everywhere. And trying to make that connection with the sort of work I'm doing at the moment is kind of tenuous. I also think that when I started WWF, the environmental message wasn't as loud and as clear and as obvious as it is today. So would my voice make any difference, really, if I started putting an environmental message into my work really explicitly, rather than in a more subtle way, I think?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I think as photographers, we're all sort of wanting to do something quite meaningful with our images, something that has a message there. And I can definitely resonate with that. I mean, I'm going tomorrow actually to help count some seabirds in one of my local seabird colonies as part of the yearly counts. But when you're actually in that environment, as you say, you're seeing all of these issues that the wildlife are facing that a lot of people aren't really that aware of. They don't know about, or they may see certain things like pollution and whatnot, and birds being stuck in fishing nets and stuff, but not everybody's aware of that. So it's definitely, as photographers now, it's when we're out and about, we're seeing these things happen. Like last year up here, we were having loads of young guillemots just being washed up on the beach, completely malnourished, and there was just no food for them all, and they were just dying on the beach, and it was horrific. And I was trying to find ways of using my kind of voice to speak about it, but I didn't really know how to incorporate it into photography and video and all that kind of stuff. But it's definitely something that I think as photographers, people are becoming more aware of. How can we use our photography to spread messages that people can see things? And going back to kind of David Attenborough that you were speaking about earlier, I mean, we've seen the tremendous impact that the documentary The Blue Planet has had, through the video and photography that brought. So, I think even us smaller photographers, kind of out there in the field, within our own audiences and our own work, there's a lot we can do there, I think, to put the message out there and make people who maybe aren't aware of things more aware. And specifically you focusing on Northumberland, I'm sure there's hundreds or thousands of people locally who aren't aware actually of what's going on locally with the environment and with the kittiwakes and other seabirds and stuff that's around there. So yeah, it's a challenge though, isn't it, to try and work out how we can actually put that message through with our photography.
Yeah, and there's very practical things you can do when I'm out photographing seabirds. And there will be dog walkers that let their dogs off the lead, and they will chase the seabirds and disturb them. So, I'm more than happy to have a quiet and polite word just to explain that, if your animals are causing the birds to lift off the shoreline, that's using energy, which is vital to them. Don't let dogs get too close to the nesting sites, and don't encroach yourselves too close to the nesting sites, because they will lift off the eggs. And on a cold morning like this morning, we have a northerly wind. The birds can't leave the eggs for too long or they'll die. And I find almost universally, people are very receptive to an informed message about conservation. And if I've given that message to one individual, and I say to them, and if you see people, in the same situation, can you spread the message? And hopefully that will have a ripple effect, and more people will kind of understand the vulnerability of, nesting shorebirds and those sorts of things as well. So I think there's it's a drop in the ocean, but I think it's got to ripple out, and it's a small contribution, I think, without being, without making a massive major donation. There are tiny little donations we can all make on a daily basis when we're out.
Definitely, 100%. And the more of us that do it, like you say, it's like a ripple effect. Once you've done it to one person, that message is slowly getting out there. We see that up in Scotland. These smaller charities or smaller people start things up, and to begin with, they're very small and closed. And then as time kind of moves on, more and more people become aware of them, and they start to grow. Like in my local area, we've had quite a lot of orca sighted over the last few weeks. And a few years ago, people probably weren't even aware that you got orca in this part of Scotland. But it was incredible. 2 weekends ago, we were watching them, and there was this massive crowd of, probably about 200 people, coming and going throughout the day to try and see the orcas, and they're becoming more aware of it. And obviously there's people there who work for conservation charities who are helping you see them and spreading the message about the conservation elements. So it just shows, over time what that can definitely do within the communities that we live in. So yeah, it's fantastic. On that note, I think it'd be good to get some of your images up and just kind of speak through them. So I was saying that you've got these incredible intimate seascape shots from your local coastline. So I'd love you to kind of speak through what kind of inspires you to take these images, how you go about looking for these shots, and kind of what each individual images mean to you. So yeah, we'll begin with this image here.
Well, I'm glad you picked this one, actually, because I love this one, and it's actually technically quite a difficult shot to take. And a little bit about all the rocks and things that I'm photographing at the moment. They constantly change. People think these sedimentary sandstone rocks, they only change over geological time. Well, actually, they change on a daily basis. I was at this very site this morning, and at the moment, this piece of rock is now covered in shingle, almost completely. And it depends on what the weather's been like. It depends on the season of the year. Sometimes if we get a strong southerly direction, we get some longshore drift, and these rocks will probably be uncovered again. And once they're uncovered, they're not pristine, as I call them, for long, because the algae will get to them, they'll go green, and also some of the colours will bleach, and then they'll get covered up again, and the seasons will change, and they'll be exposed again. And that's the reason why I don't focus on doing workshops just on the rocks, because it's a movable feast, and there's no one great honeypot that I can take people to do workshops on the rocks. This time of year, I could take people out to do workshops on the seabirds on the Farne Islands, because we have thousands and thousands of wonderful nesting seabirds, but not here. And this one, I waited until that piece of seaweed had been tossed up from the incoming tide. You can see the tide on the top of the image, and it just happened to rest for a moment, a second or two, exactly as you see it and where you see it. The next second, it was gone completely because the next wave washed over it. And a couple of practical things. I'm using a tripod, probably third of a second in terms of shutter speed there. And the other thing to be aware of is that I'm probably up to my ankles in seawater for most of these shots as well. And the North Sea's not always that warm, by the way. So ever that warm, I might add. Although it's warming up nicely now in June, it is quite it's quite an exhilarating experience for many reasons, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think that's one thing I'm realizing with my own photography now is being able to bring your full sensual immersion into it. You know, photography is a very visual thing, of course, but when you can fully submerge all your other senses in it. So in your case, actually getting into the sea and you know, whether you've got wellies or anything on, or whether you're doing it barefoot, you know, it doesn't really matter. It's the whole purpose of being there and kind of feeling the sea coming around you and fully immersing yourself in it. You know, one thing I do is wild swimming, and while I don't go wild swimming with my camera, because I'm used to being in the cold water, I've got a much deeper connection with the sea now. And it's interesting there that you were speaking about how these rocks are always changing, because I've started about 3 or 4 months ago now doing a bit of geology style photography myself. And I do notice every time you go down to a location, it's completely different. And whether the rock's wet or dry, as you say, whether it's got shingle on it or sand on it, sometimes you obviously get pebbles and stuff being tossed up. And I love in that image how you've got that bit of seaweed and how it just literally is like in the most perfect position. Like you couldn't have got it more perfect than that. And some people would probably say that you put it there, but it's brilliant to see that it was actually a natural thing and that you caught it right at that moment. And I think it shows the sheer determination and patience that goes into your photography specifically.
Well, thank you. That image is called Disembarkation, by the way, because I like the kind of idea that the sea had just tossed this piece of seaweed up and it disembarked and made land, as it were. And just to note, you know, I never put things in a scene that weren't there in the original shot, and I don't take things out of a scene that weren't there originally. And it's a kind of a purity, which is my own discipline. It might be because I can sort of say hand on heart, that wasn't put in, you know, and there will be rocks placed on my images and people think, how can that be positioned on that third? Well, I spend a long time looking for these images, and I go out with my camera, my tripod, and I can spend hours and hours on the beach, on the coastline, and not come back with an image. You know, these are distilled over a long course of time. So it's not a case of just arriving and it happening. Well, sometimes you arrive and it happens, particularly if the light's magic in the winter time. But most of it takes a lot of patience for these things to happen. And that particular one we just looked at there, that took a long time. And there were bits of seaweed in the wrong place, you know, and there was too much seawater or too little seawater. And one of the things I was trying to get there is a sense of the static with the seaweed and the rock and the movements of the wave just coming over it as well.
Yeah, it's a beautiful shot. I love the patterns in this and everything, how it kind of all plays together. And I love how you speak there about the purity of your images, because I think there's a lot of people out there who you know, as I kind of say, like they might place things into their shots, but it's really nice that you go out there and you're completely reacting to what's going on around you, and you're taking that time to find these images. And I took a shot a few months ago of these 3 pebbles, and they were just perfectly placed, almost like the piece of seaweed is here, amongst this little groove within some sandstone. And when I look at that image now, it looks like I've created it, but I didn't. I actually found those pebbles as they were. But to be able to come across those shots and know that you found that within the landscape, there's something beautiful about that when you look back on these images, because they remind you how beautiful nature is. And how there is these incredible moments of almost perfection within nature, that when you take the time to really look and mindfully immerse yourself in whatever you're photographing, you can come across them, which is, yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, and as you said earlier, Kim, you know, immersing yourself in the ocean, in the sea, really helps. It's almost like a meditation sometimes. I find, I'm standing on the coast just waiting for an image to arrive, if you like, waiting for inspiration, but you can't force it. It kind of happens over the course. If I go out and I rarely go out with an image in a particular specific image in mind. I kind of wait for that to happen. And after a while, you'll see something, you think, I've walked past that 20 times, but I've never seen it like that before. It might be the light, it might be, as you say, the time of day, the cloud cover, the brightness, or whatever. But it just sometimes I just say magic happens.
Definitely. And it's good for you to mention that you can walk past somewhere many times and never see an image. Because I think when people begin photography, they kind of feel they have to plan their shoots. They've got to go to specific locations at specific times and look for specific things. But I think as you evolve over the years as a photographer, you start to realize the beauty in just going out and reacting to whatever happens. And because you can't actually plan what's going to happen when you go out, you can have a good idea by, looking at weather apps and stuff, but you can never know for certain. And I find if I go out with no expectations in mind, I'm never disappointed, because even if I don't get an image, I've enjoyed the experience. Whereas if you go out there with a planned shot and with the expectation, you often more times than not are left disappointed. But of course, every photographer works differently, and it's about finding what works best for you. But it's interesting to hear how you approach your photography, because I love that almost reactive element to the images that you're taking.
And I like what you say there about, you don't have to come back with a visual souvenir from the experience. Just enjoy it for what it is sometimes,
Definitely. I mean, I always say photography is an experience, and I use photography as a means to get me out with my camera, and it's the experience of it that I enjoy, not necessarily the final product. If you get a final image, it's a bonus. It's the being out there that is the fun part. So yeah, this image is beautiful. The beautiful pastel-y colours within this shot. Yeah, and the lovely purpley pinkiness to it as well. What sort of time of day was this taken, and in what weather conditions?
This was this is a famous rocky outcrop on this part of the coast, which last February we had a southerly wind for a few weeks, and these rocks had become uncovered, and they were very clean. They've been covered since, because I have a friend who lives close to this, and she's kind of my spy, if you like. And I say, what are the rocks doing? Is it worth me traveling up the coast 40 miles to see them? And she say, no, they're still covered. But this time they've become uncovered, and they'd recently become uncovered, and that's why they're so clean. And for me, this is heavenly, because the sand is undisturbed, and I love finding bits of the beach that there's no footprints at all, no paw prints. So it's a lovely, still, bright but overcast day, which is perfect for the rocks. I use a polarizing filter often. I didn't need to saturate it. I didn't need to do much with the colours, and fortunately, it was one of those days where the light was just soft enough. I'm shooting on f/16 with a probably my favourite macro 100 lens, I think. So I'm kind of stepped back a bit for it, and a lot of these pictures of rocks, I'm trying to make them deliberately ambiguous in terms of scale, because I think that adds an element of mystery. Well, in this one, because I like the shape of the rocks as it came out of the sand, we've lost that sort of ambiguity of scale to a certain extent, because you can see the sand grains, of course, but it was more to do with the shape and the colours. I'm always looking for these lovely curvy shapes and how they work. And this one took a while to compose, where it felt satisfactory in terms of composition, where everything morphed in together. But yeah, it's one I've not ever shown on social media or anywhere else, to be honest. I've not even included it in my presentations. So thank you very much for representing it back to me and probably give me another look at it.
Yeah, I think it really spoke to me, like I was saying, because of the pastel-y kind of tones and textures to it, and especially the the prominent bit on the left, you know, where you've got that almost like mound sort of shape, and the beautiful blues that are coming in within that. I mean, you can tell this shot would have been difficult to compose. So it's good that you were speaking about that. And again, it shows, I guess, the time that it can take to just, you know, spend a time around your subject that interests you to get that composition and that image the way you want it to look. And the best photographers I find are the ones that spend a while really thinking about what am I wanting to tell here? You know, what is the story here? You're not just going up to that rock and saying, oh, it looks beautiful and taking a snap of it. You're really thinking about where are you placing each part of the rock, and where are you placing the different elements of the image, and how they, you know, play in together. So yeah, I think it's definitely a different image, this, and that was why I chose it out of the selection you sent me to put into this interview. So
yeah, well, thank you. And as you say, it takes a while for all the elements to come together. It would have been quite easy just to walk up to this and think, oh, it's a beautiful pattern in sand, and snap away. But I wanted to make sure that I had a picture that tried to keep the attention of the viewer, if you like. So I wanted to make sure that the corners weren't too bright and they didn't lead you out. So if you look at the top, I'm trying to almost enclose the center of the image so that we are drawn into that central valley, if you like, and yet it's reading from left to right as we look at it, with some of the shapes and curves of the rock as well. And then there's the line leading from the right. I shouldn't describe my own images, but anyway. And the line leading from the right leads us back into the image. So I'm sort of composing all these elements and trying to build them into the light, into the image as I'm working as well. And just one thing about the light, it was bright and overcast, which gave enough light to work with, and yet there were no harsh shadows to deal with, because that can be really difficult to get what I would say a fairly harmonious tonal image is, you know, when you're dealing with harsh shadows and things.
It's good to mention that, because I began as a landscape photographer, and a lot of landscape photographers are so disheartened on an overcast day, you know, because there's not that definition obviously in the clouds, and you've just got that very overcast sky. But what you kind of realise is that overcast days are incredible for photographing things on the ground if you've got the right enough brightness on that day. You know, if you change your subject matter, you know, I'm a great believer that you can get good photographs in all weather conditions. You've just got to choose the correct subject to shoot. So there is actually no such thing as bad weather for photography. There's just choosing the wrong things to shoot to work with the light. So this is a good example for people actually to show that overcast days are great to go out. You just need to photograph something a little bit different and potentially look at the ground like you've done here and come away with an image like this. So yeah, fantastic. An image that's completely different in kind of tones and textures, but obviously still related to the geology is this beautiful shot here. And I love that you've called it eye, because you can see definitely the eye within this. And there's quite often actually at the coastline quite a lot of inlets and grooves within rocks that resemble eyes if you really take the time to look at them. And I almost love obviously it's not quite symmetry because it's the individuality of the different parts of the rocks, but I love how you've positioned the crack in the middle of this image, and you've got an almost symmetrical shot going on here with the eye in the middle. So I'd love you to speak through this shot, because you've got beautiful light on some parts of this rock here.
Well, this was taken just after sunrise, so it's probably taken in the winter or the autumn, because sunrise, as you know, where you live as well, sunrise is at a very antisocial hour this time of the year. And I don't get up that often in June, unless I've got a specific seabird shoot to do at dawn. So it's probably taken in the autumn. The sea had just risen over the north, over the horizon to the east, and was just beginning to strike this outcrop, this if you like, indentation in the sandstone is now full of bits of rock and shell and sand at the moment, but it was very clean this morning. I think the tide had just come out. And what I wanted in terms of the composition was that a crack in the rock. I wanted it to almost look like it was a reflection. the bottom half look like a reflection, which it isn't. And then the shape, I called it eye. That was a comment which somebody had put when I posted this on social media. And I saw the shape of a fish there immediately. People may not see the shape of a fish at all, but that's what I immediately saw. And it was lovely that, for me, what attracted me was the center of that indentation where there's bits of fragments of shell, I think, embedded down into the crack. And that those just very tiny little bits of highlights really kind of draw you in, which I found quite interesting. Again, this was quite tricky because it was quite a lot of shadow. So the only changes I've made really in software in camera was to lighten the center a bit where it was quite dark and shadow. But it's got that sort of lighting which we do get around sunrise, being east facing, of course. Some of the rocks really do light up wonderfully well first thing in the morning.
It's beautiful that you started off seeing a fish here and now it's kind of gone into the eye. I can see both the fish and the eye. And that's one thing I'm realizing actually with more abstract images is that everybody that looks at them will see something slightly different. And for that reason, it allows people to really be immersed in them. And it's nice with this shot that we can see that there's potentially different interpretations that people can take from this image. And yeah, my dad, he's incredible when he goes out with his camera because he goes around the rocks and he sees all these faces and cliffs and he sees like these incredible like creatures and I can't always see them. And then he shows me the photographs he's taken and he zooms in and he says, look, there's the eye and there's the mouth and there's a wolf's head or whatever it may be. And it's like, oh my gosh, that's incredible. And this image just reminded me of that because you've got, like you say, the fish element and other people are seeing an eye and you could look like a monster's eye or it could be anything to people. And I love that interpretation that we can get from geology specifically.
Yeah, and we all see something different. I love some of the comments I get on social media from people because people see things that I haven't seen, and I love that. You know, that gives a depth which is fantastic. But I must say I do go out sometimes looking for shapes and faces and things in the rocks quite a lot actually, just to add an element that, as you say, that bit of interest. And we all see something different like we do in cloudscapes.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And yeah, I think I'm going more down the route of sort of this style of photography because I'm loving that individual interpretation of it as opposed to like a landscape image, for instance, which of course has its own individual interpretation. But I think landscape shots can often be quite clear what you're trying to portray. But when you're doing more abstract work, the viewer is left a lot of that to their own imagination and their own interpretation of it, which yeah, I think just adds a totally different element and meaning to the photographs that we take as photographers, which yeah, is beautiful.
And this was another one which I deliberately kind of wanted to keep it ambiguous in scale. I don't know, what would you say, Kim? What's the what's the kind of field of view do you think we have in this image?
Oh, that's a difficult one, that. Oh, yeah, I'm not really sure because have you zoomed quite far in to take this shot? Or are you using your sort of macro lens again? Or how have you actually composed this image? Because it's not clear whether you've zoomed really far into the rock or whether it's a bigger scale going on here.
Well, I'm actually quite close to the rock and I'm using a wide angle lens.
Oh.
So I'm probably a wide angle lens at 17 millimeter and I'm very, very close to the rock, but we're still seeing about probably 2 or 3 feet across the top in terms of the scale, the dimensions.
Oh.
And I often use a wide-angle lens close to the surface, just to eliminate anything out of the edges of the image that I don't want in there, but also it almost brings another dimension to it in terms of what you can see.
That's really interesting, that, because I just originally thought that you'd maybe zoomed into this image, but now that you've mentioned the wide angle aspect, you can kind of see, and potentially within different parts of the image, how that wide angle is almost giving you that slight pulling of certain areas, maybe around the edge, for instance. Like I love using wide angle in landscapes to emphasize foreground, but I've never really thought to use it in this style of imagery. But it's given you a totally different perspective of what you're seeing, which is a really creative way to add more creativity to an already very creative image. So yeah, fantastic. And your last geology shot that I wanted to share is this image here, which is just beautiful. Again, the colours you've got in this image and the different tones of blues and almost greys as well in this image is just absolutely sublime. And that coupled with the textures and patterns, this is a really, really captivating shot.
Thank you. Well, this is very local to me, and I waited 18 months for it to be uncovered. And I was there this morning, actually, and it is covered in bits of sea coal at the moment. Anyway, after some winter storms, I think I'd washed all the shingle and the sand off the coast. This beautiful sedimentary sandstone rock strata had been revealed, and it was a natural wave. And the way I wanted to photograph this was to kind of bring the pattern, as we can see it there. So it was quite tricky. Again, this was with a fairly wide angle lens, which is positioned probably probably about 10 centimeters above the surface of the rock. So I'm looking across the rock and not down. So from bottom to top, there's probably a dimension of 4 feet. And this is where I will have used, I did use focus stacking. So I'll have taken 3 or 4 shots, one in the foreground, a couple in the middle, and one at the far end of the far top, and focused on the top right hand part of the image as well, and stack those in computer to get the depth of sharpness, the depth of field that I was after. Because for me, for this to work, it has to be sharp corner to corner. And I'm still shooting the probably f11, f16 on each of those stacked images as well. So there's a certain technique involved with getting this one to get the effect that I wanted. And I was very fortunate that day that the rocks were really, really clean. Again, it was a lovely overcast morning, but quite bright, as you can see. And these rocks also get covered in algae as well by the end of the summer. So I reckon this was probably taken in winter as well.
It's really interesting because every image you've shot or spoken about here have been taken in a slightly different way, using a slightly different technique. And it's really interesting to hear how you're choosing different ways of shooting each image and what your reasoning is behind that. And you can definitely see with this shot, especially when you're kind of taking it sideways rather than looking down, that the importance there of focus stacking here to have that full focus going through the image rather than having one bit a little bit blurred. It really allows those textures and patterns within the rock to really be shown. So yeah, thank you for explaining that, because it's definitely something that I think a lot of people will find of interest there in how you have captured this image.
And I wanted to call it wave because I'd like people to look at that and hear the sea.
Oh, I love that, especially, yeah. I love that because you can see the patterns there, almost like the waves coming into shore and the different blues and that as well. Yeah, that's beautiful. It's interesting actually to hear how people name their images sometimes, because sometimes that word or that phrase that you use for an image, that title, it gets the message across that you saw in the image, but it also helps the viewer really understand what you were seeing, that maybe the image doesn't always instantly to people stand out as that, but the moment you say wave, instantly you can see the sea in this image, which is beautiful. And your final image that I want you to speak to, just because something just a little bit different, is this beautiful sea kelp here, and the way that you've captured it with the light. So yeah, very mysterious shot here, but something a little bit different, but of course still sticking with a coastal theme.
Yeah, well, kelp is my current obsession. That doesn't sound as strange as it kind of just sounded. Anyway, it probably is. But I love photographing kelp, and certain conditions have to be right. You need a spring tide to get to living kelp. I take pictures of frosted kelp stranded on the shoreline and things, but to get to as it's living is quite difficult. So you need a spring tide, you need the right conditions, i.e., a very calm North Sea, which isn't that frequent. And so the conditions were lovely, and it was a lovely bright day, as you can see. And I love watching the kelp forest as the waves gently come over, and one minute you're surrounded in a sea of in a forest of kelp, and the next wave comes along and they're all submerged, and it's just a flat sea. And for me, that's an amazing transition. And I do little video clips of this as well, which when I get time, I'm going to put together in a little video. But what I was doing here was waiting for this kelp just to break the surface. And as it breaks the surface, you can see it just captures the light. And then, a split second later, the kelp's underwater again, or most of it is exposed and it's all reflecting light. So it's actually technically one of the trickiest shots I've been trying to master at the coast at the moment, just to get the fronds as they break the surface at the lightest, but also to make sure that you've got that kind of depth of the ocean, as it gets deeper and deeper into the sea. So technically, it was quite difficult, and to try and get the aesthetics right, and not to have a very cluttered, confusing image takes a long time. I'm there until the tide almost sweeps me off the rocks.
Again, showing the dedication there, how much time and effort goes into this, and a little bit of planning, of course, for these images. But yeah, it's something I never thought about photographing. I have, of course, photographed bits that have been washed up on the shore, but yeah, to actually go out on a spring tide and try and capture this, I can just imagine the challenge, of the sea and just the kelp coming in and out of the water, and as it's moving, trying to photograph it in a way that looks interesting and it's not just a cluster of mess. So yeah, it does sound like a very challenging thing, but I imagine it can be very rewarding too, as you get the light on that wet kelp. You can get some incredible kind of not definition, that's not the right word, but incredible, just the way you've got the wetness on the kelp, but just that beautiful kind of sheen, smoothiness, and how the different tones go within it. You can get some beautiful images, can't you?
Yes, you can. And reflections are really quite difficult to handle. Polarizing filters are absolutely vital here. But trying to get some visual order in something that is a fairly fast-moving, chaotic scene does take a while. But as you say, it's quite rewarding. When I saw this and back of the camera, I was thought, yeah, I've nailed it, or I'm not leaving. I'm going to stay, as I say, until the tide sweeps me off the rocks.
Fantastic. It's always good to stay, isn't it? Because you never know what, even if you've nailed the image you kind of want, you never know what other things are going to come and be able to be photographed. So yeah, fantastic. And before we end, I just wanted to mention that you've just published a book called Intimate Landscapes of the Northumberland Coast, which I'm guessing have got most of these images in it. So yeah, if anyone's interested in your book, I thought it'd be nice for you to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for that. Shoreline, it's called. And I've been taking these images of the intimate images of the Northumberland coast for a few years, and I'd had an ambition to publish a book. I think I've one of those ambitions, a legacy of life, if you like, is to publish a book. And I had this collection of images, and it took me a while because I designed it myself, which was a real labour of love. I really enjoyed actually putting it together, curating the images, and having some semblance of a visual story and a thread that went through the book as well. And I also wanted it as something I could look back on and be proud of, and not say, actually, I wish I'd used a higher quality paper, or I wish it was bigger or something. And I published 3 months ago, and I can still look at it and say to myself, actually, I'm really pleased with Shoreline. I'm pleased with the images that are in there, and I'm quite happy with the way I've put them together. And it was a real labour of love. And it's, if you don't mind me saying, it's available for my website. People can buy it online. In fact, it's the only place in the world people can buy it is online for my website. And a limited edition. Because I wasn't confident if it would sell, and I don't have a massive social media following. I like to think of the people who follow me have been kind of nurtured over the course of time and have kind of grown up as my photography's developed over the last few years. So I don't have a massive audience, so I wasn't that confident about how many to have printed. I ended up with a print run of 300, which I'm also quite happy with the amount. And when they're all sold, and we'll take it from there as well. But yeah, it's been a very satisfying exercise to put a book together and produce a book.
That's beautiful. I've always thought about it, but it's such a big task, isn't it? And then the financial kind of output of getting the book together and everything as well. You need to have a bit of savings behind you to do it. But I've always loved the thought of actually producing a book and being able to have, a specific project you've been working on, be able to have that out there for the world. So yeah, really well done in doing that, because it does take a lot of effort and time to do that. But as you say, I think it's everybody's dream to have a book or something published in their lifetime. So yeah, huge well done for that. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. So thank you so much for your time. And I'm pretty certain that people have got something out of this and some hints and tips, but certainly some inspiration to get down to the coast and connect with it for themselves. So,
Thank you, Kim. It's great to have this chat with you. And you've inspired me to get up to the Aberdeen coast, I think, and see some of your orcas and seabirds up there. So, yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
No problem. Thank you very much. You take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.